continuing this particular trip, which began in Quetta, Pakistan, and we drove to Kandahar, Afghanistan, and from Kandahar we flew to Almaty, Kazakhstan. The client had leased a jet for us, which was very nice. But the runways were pocked again with all kinds of holes from when the Russians left. Plus, they hadn't been maintained at all. So it's going to be a rocky takeoff. But in addition, it was announced that the ceasefire between the North and the South, Taliban being in the South, was going to end at a certain hour, which is when we were going to take off, meaning all kinds of rockets would be flying up in the air, and we were not particularly interested in that, obviously. So the pilot told us about it, and he said, we're going to go now, and I'm going to take off very quickly and fly very low in a zigzag pattern, or whatever he said. So we did in fact do that. I didn't see any rockets. I don't think anybody else did. But later we heard that it was a free-for-all. You know, lots of rockets going up and coming down and everything else. I'd never been in a war zone before. It didn't particularly bother me, I guess because I had not experienced war. But it was pretty horrifying, obviously, for the people. And eventually I learned that Kandahar was virtually destroyed. I am sure that eventually, throughout all these hostilities, all the people that I had met, or a great percentage of them, in Kandahar, who'd been so nice to me, were killed. The office of the client there was destroyed. And it's all very sad. It's to no purpose whatsoever, and still isn't to this day. But we went on our way, as privileged people do, and landed in Almaty, the then capital of Kazakhstan, which was in the far west of Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan, if you look on a map, is an enormous country. At about that time, the president had moved the capital to a new location in the north of Kazakhstan, on the Russian border, I think. We surmised that it was because it would present a defense against the Russians. Who knows? In any event, he did require, the government required anybody who wanted an office in the capital, which was the new capital, to build a building or do other things to help develop the city, which was non-existent. It was just open land. I have not seen it, nor have I seen pictures since. I would like to, but I imagine it's rather grand. They do things in a big way, and they have lots of oil money. Almaty is a commercial center where they had lots of Western goods, Chanel stores, and it's very different than the mud huts in Afghanistan, I must say. The difference between having oil and not having oil. It is said that there are enormous natural resources in Afghanistan. I've never heard details of that. I don't think it was oil and gas. I think it was probably more minerals, but I don't know. but certainly no one's developed them, and the Afghanis are still in the same sad position they have been for many, many, many years. So we spent time in Almaty, meeting with various officials, negotiating, I'm not quite sure what now that I sit here, but the deal, we were there on the pipeline. Although it didn't go through Kazakhstan, I think I recall that they were talking about a Kazakh pipeline joining the Turkmen pipeline around or through the Caspian Sea, which would be very, very good for the Kazakhs. Met a lot of generals and ministers of state and so forth. Can't remember any of them, but it was all quite interesting. While we were there, I did find out that the assistant, if you will, to my client, who was a very senior person, and I mean he was just an assistant, was negotiating for a Coca-Cola franchise in Kazakhstan. And I heard years later that the client was granted the franchise, which would be worth a huge amount of money, obviously. Anyhow, we eventually took off from Almaty on our way to Uzbekistan, I believe. But I'm reminded that while we were in Almaty, staying at the governor's guest house, it's always the governor's guest house, which is, as I've always said, it's a ramshackle kind of place. My laptop was running out of battery power. And I was supposed to draft a release, a PR release, if nothing else, because all these people were going to come for a press conference with the president and my client and all these other people. So I told the client's assistant that I was running out of battery power and I didn't know how I was going to do it. So he talked to somebody, and next thing I knew, this very large, almost crate, it was probably 3 by 4 by 6 feet high, not that high, but probably 4. Anyway, was rolled out and stood next to me, and it was a converter of some kind, because I couldn't plug into their plugs. And he took it and he fooled around with a socket in the wall and stripped the wires and redid them and plugged it in. And then he said, I will plug your machine into this machine. And I thought, well, I don't have any power left anyway, so if it blows up, what difference does it make? He plugged it in. Sure enough, worked perfectly. I had 100% power, and it was able to prepare the release for the president and my client to issue and announce. They were out on the front stairs of this, or the porch, if you will, of this governor's guest house with various news reporters, one of which I remember was from the Financial Times of London. So it was a big deal. What they were exactly announcing, I've never known, but at least they had my release, which was a little vague, and they concluded it, and handshakes all around, and I got thanks for getting the thing out, and I said, no, it's, your worker here, and he was bowing, and everybody was happy. So that was a lesson in necessity is the mother of invention. I think that's the phrase. Because he fiddled around and did wires all over, and it worked. I don't know what was inside that big box, don't want to know. It's just the same as in Azerbaijan, where the oil rigs were very old and decrepit. And those guys were able to jimmy around and make them work, and they did work. The only problem was the rigs up on the land had troughs dug around them in order that if there was a blowout or a leakage, the oil could gather in a pool and soak into the ground. We might have something to say about that today, but these guys were incredibly inventive because they had to be. They had no other way of achieving the results that were expected of them.